This podcast is brought to you by Revival, Book 1 of the Unveiled Book Series.
Welcome to the AI Analysis Podcast. Today we're taking a look at what might be the most beloved book of all time.
And that title, Most Beloved, is definitely earned, not just given. We are plunging headlong into the monumental achievement of J.R.R. Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings.
Right, and you may have seen the movies, which are incredible in their own right, but the original books, the sheer scale of the work and, the almost accidental way it was created, it's staggering.
It absolutely is, and it really demands this kind of comprehensive analysis.
Okay, so let's set the stage here. We are talking about an epic, high fantasy novel, or I guess a series of novels, that didn't just become popular, it basically created the modern fantasy genre as we know it.
It really did. One commentator called it an avalanche of new books, games, and films that followed, and that avalanche is still going. Decades later, it's the foundation for almost everything.
And the success, it's not just a passing trend. We're talking about global, enduring cultural dominance.
The last time they did a full count, it was well over 150 million copies sold worldwide. And, that number just keeps ticking up with every new generation that discovers it.
That number is already mind-boggling, but here's the fact that really puts it in perspective. You have to forget about the 3 book titles for a second.
Right, the ones we all know. Fellowship, Two Towers, Return of the King.
Exactly. If you count it as the single work that Tolkien always intended it to be, it ranks as either number 1 or number 2 on the list of best-selling English fiction.
Of all time.
Of all time. It's just astonishing.
It puts it right up there with classics like A Tale of Two Cities, but even those older books have, less reliable sales figures. Tolkien's work is a proven, documented giant of the 20th century.
And it's not just about sales. The emotional connection people have to this book is profound. You see it in these huge literary polls.
Oh, yeah. Like the BBC's Big Read survey back in 2003. It was overwhelmingly voted Britain's best-loved novel.
Not just a top 10, but number 1.
And that wasn't just a British thing, which is key to its universal appeal. Similar polls in Germany and Australia came back with the same result. It was their favorite book, too.
It's a level of international literary devotion that you just don't see for many other single works.
Almost none.
Now, this is where we hit the first big surprise for a lot of people, especially if you grew up with the trilogy format. Tolkien never wanted it to be 3 separate books, did he?
Absolutely not. He was emphatic about it. He saw the whole story, including the massive appendices and maybe even the Silmarillion, as one single unified volume.
One giant book.
His vision was this one monumental tome.
I can't even imagine how big that would have been. We're talking over 1,000 pages, 500,000 words, and that's before you even add in the appendices.
A true doorstop of a book. So the big question is, if that's what he wanted, why did his publisher, George Allen and Unwin, split it up?
And the answer is surprisingly mundane.
Completely. It all came down to economics.
Yeah.
Just the pure logistics of printing in post-war Britain.
The cost of paper, the cost of printing a single massive volume in the 1950s was just prohibitive. And they weren't even sure it would sell.
Exactly. They were worried about this huge, complex fantasy work. They thought sales might be modest at best. They were being very risk-averse.
So to mitigate a potential financial disaster, they split the manuscript into 3. They published The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King one after the other between 1954 and 1955.
It spread the cost out and lowered their financial risk. A very savvy business move looking back, but it was deeply frustrating for Tolkien.
He felt it disrupted the artistic flow of the narrative.
He did. And he had a particular dislike for one of the titles they chose.
The Return of the King. Why did that one bother him so much?
He thought it was a massive spoiler. It gives away the entire endgame for Aragorn's story, his return to the throne.
Right. It removes all the tension from that part of the story.
He much preferred something like The War of the Ring, something that kept the focus on the conflict itself, not the resolution.
That makes total sense from a storytelling perspective. And what about The Two Towers? That title has always been a bit ambiguous.
It has. Even Tolkien seemed to struggle to pin it down. He actually wrote that the title can be left ambiguous, which suggests he wanted it to be more evocative than literal.
So he played with a few different ideas of which 2 towers it meant.
Oh, yes. Initially, he considered pairings like Orthanc, Saruman's Tower, and Barad-dûr, Sauron's fortress. Or maybe Minas Tirith and Barad-dûr, the ultimate showdown of good versus evil.
But he did eventually settle on a specific pairing, didn't he?
He did. In a later note, and for a cover illustration he drew, he identified them as Minas Morgul, the Witch King's fortress, and Orthanc.
Which is interesting. That pairing seems to emphasize the two fronts of the war.
Exactly. The threat from the corrupted west with Saruman and the active ancient evil from the east with Minas Morgul. It's just fascinating that a decision based on printing costs ended up defining how generations experienced this single massive story.
A book to rule them all, whose very form was decided by a budget meeting.
Which is a perfect way to transition, actually. Because to understand why he cared so much about his vision, you have to understand the man who created it.
John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. He was much more than just a writer.
Oh, worlds more. He was a respected English academic, a devout Catholic, and first and foremost, a professional philologist.
And what exactly is a philologist?
A specialist in the history of languages, how they're built, how they evolve, how they connect to literature and culture. That academic rigor is what makes his world feel so real.
But the deepest influences on his work didn't come from a library. They came from the trenches of World War I.
The Great War left an absolutely indelible mark on him, both physically and psychologically. He served with the Lancashire Fusiliers on the Western Front.
And he saw action at the Battle of the Somme in 1916, one of the bloodiest battles in human history.
He was thrown right into that inferno. He was a junior officer leading desperate assaults on German defenses like the Schwaben Redoubt. The casualty rates for men in his position were astronomical.
Just incomprehensible. Officers were expected to lead the charge over the top, and they were often the first to be cut down. He later said leaving his wife for France felt like a death.
And it was during this unrelenting slaughter that his body just gave out. He contracted trench fever.
Which was a horrible, debilitating disease carried by the lice that were everywhere in the trenches.
Right. On October 27, 1916, the fever took hold, and he was invalided home. And in a strange way, that illness almost certainly saved his life.
But the emotional cost was immense. He survived, but he returned to find his world had been emptied.
He got back to England, weak and emaciated, and learned his battalion had been practically wiped out. And worse, so many of his closest friends were gone.
Members of his secret society, the TCBS?
Yes, the Tea Club and Barovian Society. And this wasn't just a group of school chums, this was his intellectual and artistic core.
What was their purpose, their shared mission?
They had this grand promise to each other, that they would reshape the world through their art and literature. And then the war came.
And they were killed, one by one.
Rob Gilson died on the very first day of the Somme. Jeffrey Smith was killed by an artillery shell. Tolkien felt this crushing weight of responsibility.
So in a way, creating Middle-earth wasn't just a creative project, it became a kind of memorial.
Exactly. He felt he had to fulfill the collective artistic promise of the TCBS because his friends no longer could.
And you can see that trauma etched directly onto the map of Middle-earth.
Without a doubt. His depiction of Mordor, that blasted ashen landscape of industry and shadow, is the Western Front. It's the mud, the craters, the splintered trees, the poisoned air.
And he even used that experience to deliver a pretty sharp social critique with his monsters, particularly the orcs.
He did. He didn't see them as just generic evil minions. He said he viewed them as brutalized workers, tortured and twisted by the machinery of war and industry.
So they represent the dehumanizing effect of all that.
Yes, and that connects directly to his own political views. He was deeply skeptical of centralized state power.
He really distrusted politicians and the whole idea of bossing other men.
He wrote that the most improper job of any man is bossing other men. Not one in a million is fit for it, and least of all those who seek the opportunity.
Wow. That sentiment is basically the entire philosophical core of The Lord of the Rings, isn't it? The whole idea that power itself is corrosive.
It is. The desire to dominate others is what he called the original and enduring temptation of evil. His experience in the war gave him this deep-seated distrust of big top-down systems.
Which is why he champions the small, community-focused life of the Shire.
It's the perfect contrast. The pastoral, humble life of the hobbits versus the industrialized tyranny of Sauron. And of course Saruman, who cuts down the forests of Isengard to fuel his war machine.
Saruman's betrayal is so potent because he's destroying the natural world, which Tolkien clearly loved.
It shows his distrust of mass production and unchecked technology. The orcs aren't just soldiers. They're the exploited cogs in a machine of war.
Okay, so let's move from the brutal landscapes of war to something incredibly beautiful, the story of his courtship with Edith Bratt.
It's a romance that could have been pulled directly from one of his own stories. It's just remarkable.
He met her when he was only 16.
Right, and she was 3 years older and a Protestant, which was a huge problem for his guardian, Father Francis Morgan, who was a Catholic priest.
And his guardian just forbade the relationship entirely.
Completely. He prohibited Tolkien from meeting, speaking to, or even writing to Edith until he turned 21. He was worried it would interfere with his studies and his faith.
And Tolkien actually obeyed him. For years.
He did, scrupulously. But you can imagine how that forced separation just intensified everything. The moment the clock struck midnight on his 21st birthday, he acted.
He wrote to her immediately.
Declared his love and asked her to marry him.
But after years of silence, she'd assumed he'd forgotten her and had moved on.
That's the tragic twist. She had accepted another man's proposal. But when she got Tolkien's letter, she broke off her engagement immediately.
She converted to Catholicism for him, and they were married in 1916, right before he was shipped off to France.
And that real-life romance became the absolute heart of his mythology, the story of Beren and Luthien.
The mortal man and the immortal elf maiden.
It's the central love story of the Silmarillion, and it's directly inspired by Edith. During his recovery from trench fever, they were walking in a clearing in Yorkshire, and she danced for him among the flowering hemlock.
That image, a moment of pure beauty in the middle of all that darkness and recovery, it must have been so powerful for him.
It stayed with him his entire life. He wrote later that she was the source of the story. It wasn't just a sweet dedication, it was the foundation for the entire relationship between humans and elves in his world.
The idea that love could cross those impossible boundaries.
Precisely. And in the end, their life and his fiction became one. They're buried together in Oxford, and their gravestone has their names, and then beneath them the words Beren and Luthien.
It's the ultimate convergence of love and literature. Just beautiful.
So how does a man with all this trauma and this deep romance find a way to express it all? Not just in a story, but in an entire world. The answer is in the languages he was building before the stories even existed.
This is the thing that sets Tolkien apart from almost every other fantasy author. He wasn't just making up cool-sounding names. He was a professional philologist.
With a deep academic understanding of how languages work.
Right. We mentioned he worked on the Oxford English Dictionary. He was responsible for the history and etymology of words, starting with WO. That takes incredible precision and patience.
And that obsession with words led to his creative process, which he called mythopoeia. Can you break that down for us?
Mythopoeia literally means myth-making. But for Tolkien, the process started with language. He didn't write a story and then invent names. He created a language first because he loved the sound of it.
Like Finnish or Welsh, he found them aesthetically beautiful. Exactly. He built languages based on sounds he loved, and then he realized, a language needs a people to speak it. And a people need a history, a culture, a land to live in.
So the stories and the geography all grew out of the languages themselves.
That's it. The complex Elvish languages are the bedrock that Middle-earth is built on. It's why it all feels so consistent and historical. It grew organically, just like real-world cultures.
Let's talk about the two main Elvish languages he created, Quenya and Sindarin. What were their influences?
Okay, so Quenya, which he developed pretty early, around 1917, was heavily inspired by Finnish. He thought Finnish phonology was just uniquely beautiful.
And Quenya was supposed to be like Elven Latin, right? A classical ceremonial language?
Yes, used by the High Elves. Finnish is very vocalic, lots of vowel sounds, not many harsh consonant clusters. It gives Quenya this flowing, majestic, almost musical quality. It sounds ancient and noble.
And then you have Sindarin, which is what most of the characters actually speak in the books.
Sindarin was influenced by Welsh. And Welsh phonology is much more complex. It has consonant mutations, where the start of a word changes depending on the word before it.
Which makes it sound more like a living, evolving language.
Absolutely. Sindarin feels a little rougher, more grounded. It's the language of the elves who stayed in Middle-earth. So when you hear Aragorn speak it, you understand he's tapping into this deep, living culture, not just reciting some made-up words.
The level of planning is it's mind-blowing. And this dedication to ancient texts brings us to Beowulf. His lecture on it in 1936 completely changed the game for medieval studies.
It was a revolution. Before Tolkien, scholars treated Beowulf mostly as a linguistic artifact, a source for Old English grammar. They kind of dismissed the monsters, Grendel and the dragon, as silly distractions.
They saw it as a history book with some unfortunate fantasy bits tacked on.
Pretty much. They wanted to focus on the tribal history and ignore the actual story. Tolkien came in and argued that they were missing the entire point.
What was his core argument?
He argued that the monsters were essential, that the poet was using Grendel and the dragon to explore huge universal themes: life, death, fate, human destiny. He insisted that people read it as a powerful work of poetry and myth.
So he put the meaning back into it, and that must have validated his own work, using dragons and elves to talk about big ideas.
Absolutely. He called Beowulf one of his most valued sources. Smaug, the dragon in The Hobbit, has a lot in common with the Beowulf dragon. He basically proved that myth-making was a high literary art form.
It's incredible how his academic and fictional worlds were so intertwined. And some of the most famous parts of his world came from, well, literary disappointments.
Yes. The Ents are a perfect example of this. As a scholar, Tolkien was deeply disappointed by Shakespeare's Macbeth.
With the prophecy that Macbeth can't be defeated until Birnam Wood comes to Dunsinane Castle.
Right. And then in the play, it just turns out to be an army of soldiers carrying tree branches as camouflage. Tolkien felt completely cheated.
He thought it was a cop-out.
A total cop-out. So he decided that if his story needed an army of trees, it was going to be an actual army of trees. And so we get the Ents. It shows his commitment to the internal logic of fantasy.
And so many of the physical places in Middle-earth were pulled directly from his own life.
Oh, yeah. Bilbo's journey across the Misty Mountains, especially that part where they slide down the stones. That was from a hiking trip he took in the Swiss Alps in 1911.
He specifically mentioned seeing the Jungfrau and Silberhorn peaks and thinking they were the mountains of his dreams.
He translated that real physical experience of awe and fear directly onto the page. Even something as cozy as Bag End, Frodo's home, was named after his aunt's farm.
It's that mix of epic sagas, academic precision, and these small personal details that makes it all feel so real.
And speaking of real, we have to talk about C.S. Lewis. He was more than just a friend in the Inklings literary group. He's the one who really pushed Tolkien to write a story.
Right. It sounds like Tolkien was perfectly happy just creating languages and genealogies forever.
He was. The Inklings would meet, and Lewis, being a narrative writer himself, was the one constantly asking, but where's the story?
There's that great quote from Tolkien about it.
He said he wrote the novel because Lewis had to have a story. And that story, The Lord of the Rings, was written to keep him quiet.
So Lewis was basically his first and most demanding fan.
He created a necessary audience for this massive, sprawling imagination. Without that push, it might have all just stayed in Tolkien's notebooks.
And the ultimate irony is that years later, Lewis nominated Tolkien for the Nobel Prize in Literature.
In 1961, yes. And he was rejected.
The committee's reason was just brutal.
They said his writing did not in any way measure up to storytelling of the highest quality. It was just dismissed.
When you put that judgment next to 150 million copies sold and the creation of an entire genre, it shows how out of touch critics can sometimes be with truly groundbreaking work.
They just weren't ready for what he'd created.
The veil between her world and the other realm has faded, unleashing magic into the lives of ordinary citizens. Awakening from a 4-year coma, Tori James discovers a world transformed. For some, like Tori, the unveiling ignites hidden abilities. With her expertise in classical languages, she's drawn into a world of thieves and magic. Join Tori on her magical journey in Book 1 of the Unveiled book series, Revival. Unveil your destiny.
Welcome back. We've dug into the history, the academic roots, the trauma that built Middle-earth. Now let's get into some of the most surprising facts and how this deeply personal world was received by a totally different generation.
And let's start with a moment of creation that is just so wonderfully human. The darkest, most iconic verse in the entire saga, the inscription on the ring, was written while Tolkien was taking a bath.
The bathtub revelation. It's just a perfect image, this brilliant, serious professor just having a soak, and this flash of pure evil genius strikes.
Exactly. Let's just hear that verse again because the power of it is incredible.
3 rings for the elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone.
9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne, in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie.
1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all in the darkness bind them, in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. Just chillin'.
It really is.
And from poetry, we go to another linguistic legacy. Tolkien actually coined a word that we all use now, tween.
That's right. It didn't originally mean a preteen. In Middle-earth, a tween was a hobbit between the ages of 20 and 33.
So it was their version of being a young adult or an adolescent.
Exactly. They came of age at 33, so this is that in-between period. Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin were all technically tweens at the start of their journey.
Amazing that a bit of Hobbit jargon just leaked out into the real world.
It shows he was always a philologist, always playing with words.
Now, for something a bit more dramatic, the crisis that forced Tolkien to revise the entire book, it involved a U.S. publisher basically pirating his work.
The Great Copyright Crisis of 1965. A publisher called Ace Books found this bizarre loophole in U.S. copyright law and published an unauthorized, royalty-free paperback version.
I can't imagine how furious he must have been to see his life's work being sold with zero compensation. How did he fight back?
He fought back with the text itself. He rushed out a second edition. He corrected a bunch of typos. But crucially, he made enough substantial changes to the text to qualify for a new U.S. copyright.
He used his words as a legal weapon.
He did. And once the official Ballantine paperback hit the U.S. market, it was affordable and the series just exploded. Which leads us to the endless question of allegory.
Right. Because it came out after World War II, everyone assumes the ring is the atomic bomb, or Mordor is Nazi Germany.
Or the Soviet Union? The theories have been around forever.
But Tolkien himself was adamant that it was not an allegory.
He hated allegory. And he had a very specific, very logical argument against that reading. First, the timeline doesn't work. He started writing in 1937, long before the bomb.
But his main argument was more about the story's internal morality, wasn't it?
Yes. He said if the story was an allegory for the war, the ending would have been totally different. If the ring was just a weapon, the good guys would have used it.
They would have taken it and used it against Sauron.
Exactly. They would have destroyed Barad-dûr, but then a new Dark Lord, maybe Gandalf, corrupted by that power, would have risen in its place. The result would have just been a change in management, not the destruction of evil.
And the hobbits would have been crushed in that new world order.
He wrote, they would not long have survived even as slaves. The fact that the ring must be destroyed and that humility triumphs proves it's a story about universal moral choices, not just a coded history lesson.
He preferred the word applicability.
Right. The story is applicable to many situations, but it's not defined by any single one.
But despite him saying all that, the book became a massive icon for the 1960s counterculture in America. How did that happen?
It was a perfect storm. The cheap paperback made it accessible to students. And the themes just resonated so strongly with the anti-war, anti-establishment feeling of the time.
They saw anti-pollution messages, the destruction of nature.
The Ents fighting back against Saruman's industrial machine. That was a powerful image for the early environmental movement. The Shire was seen as this ideal, simple life they were striving for.
And it became part of the culture. Frodo lives and Gandalf for president.
Those slogans were everywhere. On buttons, bumper stickers, all over college campuses. It became a kind of manifesto.
And that popularity boom created a demand for visual art, which shaped how we all see Middle-earth now.
It did. Tolkien's own covers were very simple. But the mass-market paperbacks needed art. That's when artists like Alan Lee and John Howe became hugely popular.
And their vision became so definitive that Peter Jackson hired them to be the art directors for the films.
It's a fascinating feedback loop. The fan vision becomes the official cinematic vision. Though, not everyone loved their interpretations. Some critics felt they strayed from Tolkien's very specific descriptions.
Like with the Tower of Orthanc.
Exactly. Tolkien described Orthanc as being made of a shiny black obsidian-like stone, perfectly smooth and unadorned, terrifying in its simplicity. Many illustrations add Gothic spires and carvings that aren't in the text. It just shows how hard it is to perfectly adapt such a detailed world.
As we get toward the end here, let's look at the wider legacy. There were so many attempts to adapt this story long before the Peter Jackson films.
Oh, absolutely. And some of them were really influential, like the 1981 BBC radio dramatization.
Which has a great connection to the movies. The actor Ian Holm, who played Bilbo in the films.
He played Frodo in that radio show.
Yeah.
A great piece of trivia. It connects the two great adaptations of the 20th century.
And then there's the adaptation that could have been the weirdest movie ever made.
The Beatles musical.
I still can't quite believe that was a real plan.
It was. In the late 60s, they wanted to make a movie musical. John Lennon was going to be Gollum, Paul McCartney was Frodo, Ringo was Sam, and George Harrison was Gandalf.
And they wanted Stanley Kubrick to direct it?
The story goes that Tolkien himself put a stop to it. He refused to sell them the film rights. It probably would have been a psychedelic trip, something like Yellow Submarine meets Middle-earth.
We probably dodged a bullet there, but it shows how massive the books were. And speaking of fans, we have to mention Christopher Lee.
Maybe the ultimate Tolkien fan. He reread the books every single year, and he was so desperate to be in the films.
He wanted to play Gandalf originally.
He did, but by the time they were casting, he was a bit too old for the physical demands of the role. But he was just perfectly cast as Saruman. He brought so much gravitas and deep knowledge of the text to that part.
And that sense of commitment were shared by the actors in the Fellowship.
The Fellowship tattoo. It's such a great story. The bond they formed filming in New Zealand was so strong that 8 of the 9 actors got a matching tattoo.
The Elvish number 9 for the 9 members of the Fellowship.
Elijah Wood, Ian McKellen, Orlando Bloom, Viggo Mortensen, Sean Astin, Billy Boyd, Dominic Monaghan, and Sean Bean. All of them got it.
The only one who didn't was John Rhys Davies, who played Gimli.
He politely declined. But his stunt double, Brett Beatty, who spent even more time in the heavy Gimli prosthetics, he got the tattoo in John's place. So the 9 remained complete.
That's perfect. A real-life fellowship mirroring the one on screen. And it all brings us back to that central philosophical theme.
The one we touched on earlier, the corrupting influence of power, and how the desire to dominate others is the ultimate evil.
It's why the powerful characters like Gandalf and Galadriel refuse to take the ring.
That's the moral core of the whole story. They know that even with the best intentions, the ring's power would twist them into tyrants. Gandalf says his rule would be even more terrible than Sauron's because he'd believe he was doing good.
The only true victory is to renounce that power and destroy it.
A lesson born from his faith, his studies, and his experiences in a world-destroying war. And the final beautiful point is that only the smallest, most humble creatures, the hobbits, are able to resist its corruption long enough to destroy it.
It's the ultimate triumph of the small and the good over the grand and powerful.
So when you step back and look at the whole thing, it's just extraordinary.
Yeah, you have this quiet academic, a philologist obsessed with the sound of words, a survivor of the Somme,
who painstakingly builds entire languages just for the beauty of them, and is finally pushed by his friend to write a story.
And that singular private obsession results in a world that millions of people feel they've actually visited, a mythology that defines a genre.
It just tells you that sometimes the most powerful universal art doesn't come from a desire for fame or money. It comes from deep, personal, academic passion rooted in profound experience.
So a final thought for you to consider. Considering the sheer complexity and breadth of Tolkien's created world, from its constructed languages and massive genealogies to its detailed geography, all rooted in his academic study of medieval texts and his own traumatic war experiences, what does it tell us about the power of singular creative obsession to move millions of people across generations?
We hope you enjoyed this analysis into The Lord of the Rings. Are you a fan of LOTR? Let us know in the comments. We'll see you next time.